Paris, 1848. A filthy, decaying, putrid city of over 1 million people. Louis-Philippe had been on the throne for 18 years, and on the morning of February 22nd, thousands of students took to the streets to protest the king's failure of economic leadership. 30,000 troops were deployed to meet the protesters, but their true sympathies rested with the working class. By the next morning, protesters had erected more than 1,500 barricades and hid behind them until they decided to attack. The new regime collapsed, and months later, in December of 1848, the people of France chose a new leader. His name was Louis Napoleon, and he had a plan to transform Paris. The shining light of a modern age. George Eugene Haussmann and Napoleon III revolutionized the field of urban design with their reinvention of Paris between 1852 and 1870, emphasizing a unified approach to architecture and an open spatial plan. This design philosophy, emulated by Daniel Burnham in Cleveland, Ohio, and in other cities, launched a wave of city planning based on improving the quality of life of citizens. The Paris that Louis-Philippe left behind had not changed significantly since the Middle Ages. As Maxime Duchamp, a Parisian writer, described the period, Paris in its state following the 1848 revolution was on the point of becoming uninhabitable. Its population was suffocating in the tiny, narrow, putrid, and tangled streets in which it had been dumped. The biggest problem, as Louis Napoleon saw it, was the helplessness of the government against rebels hiding behind barricades. The streets were so narrow that troops in one part of the city could not move quickly enough to another. Louis Napoleon, better known as Napoleon III, wanted to make it impossible for protesters to erect barricades against him. First, he had to solidify his power, so in 1851 the president led a coup and declared himself emperor. Napoleon was now positioned to institute the transformations, and in 1853 he chose Georges Eugene Haussmann, a Parisian bureaucrat, to carry out his vision. Construction started immediately. It is estimated that during his tenure, Haussmann displaced 350,000 people. As he described it, "We ripped open the belly of old Paris, the neighborhood of revolt and barricades." In its place came architecture known as the street wall. Each block was composed of a few large, uniformly designed buildings with small central courtyards and uniformed features on the outside. Next, Napoleon ordered the building of long roads to connect the center of the city to railway stations, which the emperor considered the future of transportation. Two medieval churches stood in the way of the new Boulevard de Sebastopol, but for Napoleon and Haussmann, urban function took precedence over history. In 1856, Haussmann began the transformation of the Ile de la Cité, the largest island in the Seine River, which had been described as having mud-colored houses, broken by a few worm-eaten window frames, which almost touched at the eaves, so narrow were the streets. Determined to transform it to a clean, open space, Haussmann destroyed virtually every home, forcibly reducing the island's population from 15,000 to 5,000. The island became an administrative center, populated by Notre Dame Cathedral and various government buildings. Napoleon's foremost aim in renovating Paris was to make it impossible to stage a revolution like the one, ironically, that brought him to power. He made troop movements easier by building streets that connected the soldiers' barracks to potential trouble spots. For example, the Boulevard Voltaire was built to move troops from the Place de la République to the Place de la Nation in a rebellious part of the city. In addition, cobblestones had been replaced by tarmac to prevent the people from taking up the pavement as weapons. Napoleon knew that the Latin Quarter was one potential point of rebellious behavior, so he built boulevards through it, effectively slicing the neighborhood into many parts and diminishing much of its revolutionary potency. This boulevardization was a form of social discipline that Napoleon perfected to ensure that another revolution would not bring him down. Paris was now, in the words of one French historian, as strategically ordered as any battlefield. From his time in London, Napoleon strongly believed that parks improved the quality of people's lives. Twice during his tenure, he donated official state property to be developed into parks. Napoleon also expanded several existing parks in the city, and by 1870 there were 1,800 hectares of parks, up from just 19 in 1848. Along with Napoleon's desire for parkland came his hatred of industry within the city. Haussmann shared the emperor's dislike, writing in 1857, "There is no need for Paris, capital of France, metropolis of the civilized world, to contain factories and workshops. Paris should be the center of intellectual and artistic activity, the center of the financial and commercial movements of the country." This revolutionary decision to encourage residential and business development over industrial development set Paris on the trajectory it is still on today. By 1870, Napoleon's regime was growing weak. 3/4 of the Parisian electorate opposed the emperor, and the funding system for Haussmann's projects had become unstable. Haussmann was forced to resign in disgrace, and weeks later, Prussia invaded Paris, deposing Napoleon III. Though Napoleon and Haussmann accomplished many things, the changes mainly benefited the upper class. The 1/3 of households that still did not have running water despite a new sewer system, and 4/5 that had no gas supply were mostly in the poorer eastern section of the city. Napoleon's aim of making the streets wide enough to make barricades obsolete was not completely successful, as evidenced by the fiery barricades during the Commune of Paris in 1871. Nevertheless, Napoleon and Haussmann remade Paris from a dirty medieval city to a sparkling modern metropolis. More importantly, they redefined what a city could be. Before, cities had simply expanded through natural means. Haussmann showed that a city could be intentionally remade. The remaking of Paris would soon draw new urban planners to study its wide boulevards, large parks, and stately buildings. The wave of industrialization that swept both France and America and brought factories into the city core was a catalyst for the City Beautiful movement. At its foundation was the value that with a beautiful city came improved quality of life for its citizens. Many American architects, including Daniel Burnham, the preeminent City Beautiful designer, visited Paris and came away inspired. Ironically, the design that Burnham saw as a means to improve the lives of people had originally been created to protect Napoleon from the people. As Burnham visited Paris, a consensus was emerging in Cleveland, Ohio, that a plan should be commissioned to reverse the effects of industrialization.
Industrialization was a big, nasty process in Cleveland. It created enormous wealth, but at the cost of horrendous living conditions that we can't possibly imagine today. So the skies were filthy, the river was completely full of sewage and industrial waste, the lake was filthy, and this was becoming an embarrassment to the city of Cleveland, which wanted to view itself as a modern, progressive place.
The city contacted Daniel Burnham to design a plan for downtown Cleveland. On August 17, 1903, he presented its report. Paris influenced many parts of the design. Large neoclassical buildings would flank a central mall. The inspiration came from Parisian landmarks such as the Tuileries and the Luxembourg Gardens, which in the words of one of Burnham's colleagues, give relief to the city and bring within the daily and hourly reach of the people all the beauties and comforts of nature. The government buildings near the mall were also modeled on Parisian designs. For example, the nearly identical structures of the Library and Federal Building replicated the identical structures in the Place de la Concorde. Like Haussmann, Burnham had a love of railroads and recognized their significance to the heart of the city. However, the final design did not include the central railroad station he had envisioned.
The idea that Burnham had was that the train station is the great entry point to the city of Cleveland, and that visitors arriving would be struck by this magnificent vista of stone neoclassical buildings with a big civic open space in the middle, the mall, where people would be strolling up and down and enjoying the fresh air and the gardens.
As Burnham himself described it, in bringing the visitor to Cleveland through a magnificent section of the city, his first impression, which is usually the most lasting, would be a favorable one. 30 years after Haussmann completed his transformation of Paris, it proved to be the key inspiration to Daniel Burnham and his design of Cleveland. Just like Paris, Cleveland had been designed with magnificent vistas, public gardens, and a uniform architectural style. Burnham himself was inspired by Paris and countless other designs, including those of Canberra, Chicago, and Manila. What Burnham, as well as numerous other city planners, had seen in Paris was a city that had been transformed from darkness to the shining light of a new, modern age.